This is the story of Korean Airlines Flight 064. For the past few months, and honestly year, we've been talking about accidents up in the sky. After all, this is mini air crash investigation. But it is important to note that things can definitely go wrong when you're on the ground. This is one of those stories. It was the 23rd of December, 1986. A thick fog hung over Anchorage International Airport, Alaska. On the ground at Anchorage, the pilot of a small Piper PA-31 filed an instrument plan to fly from Anchorage to Kenai in Alaska. But the ground controller had some bad news for the pilot of the Piper. The weather was so bad that it would take some time for the Piper to get its takeoff clearance. So, the pilot of the Piper decided to shut his engines down and sent his passengers back to the terminal to wait the weather out. A while later, they were back on the airplane and ready to go. The engines of the Piper sputtered to life as the pilot got ready to taxi in the dense fog. As the visibility started to improve, the Piper got its taxi clearance. The pilot of the Piper had two options for taking off. He could either go with runway 6 left or runway 6 right. As per company policy, he elected to use the full length of runway 6 left for takeoff. Soon, the small Piper was on its way to runway 6 left. As the small Piper taxied, at another point in the airport, an absolutely gigantic DC-10 was getting ready to depart as well. It was a Korean Airlines cargo DC-10 that was on its way to LA, California. As the Piper made its way around the airport, Flight 064 was allowed to start its massive engines up. The crew were given a choice of departure runways as well. They could choose either runway 6 right or runway 32. The pilots of the Korean DC-10 chose runway 32. Under the cloak of fog, the huge DC-10 started taxiing as well. The pilot of the DC-10 let the controllers know that he was on the east-west taxiway and that he would be ready for takeoff soon. But the controller couldn't see anything due to the fog. Soon, the huge DC-10 was ready to go. The controller cleared the jet to line up and hold on runway 32. The controller quickly checked in with the pilot of the Piper to see where he was. He was at the Whiskey 3 intersection. Satisfied by that answer, the controller let the Piper line up on runway 6 left. The controller had both planes exactly where he wanted them, and at 2:04 p.m., the Korean Airlines jet was given its takeoff clearance. The pilot of the Korean jet made a call out letting everyone know that he was starting his takeoff roll. Unknown to everyone, the giant DC-10 was headed right for the tiny Piper. They were on a collision course. As the DC-10 picked up speed, the pilot saw two things that probably scared the living daylights out of him. The first being that somehow he was already out of runway, and the second being a tiny Piper PA-31 waiting for its takeoff clearance on his runway. In the Piper, the pilot saw two lights through the fog. He wondered what a truck was doing on the runway when he was on it. To his horror, he realized that it wasn't a truck, but instead another plane that was headed right for him. He asked his passengers to duck and brace for impact. In the cockpit of the DC-10, the captain pulled back on the yoke, lifting the nose off the ground, and slammed the rudder to the left. The huge plane yawed to the left as the pilot made a last-ditch attempt to avert the collision. The main landing gear slammed into the tiny Piper, ripping it apart. The DC-10 had too much speed to stop, and it went through all the approach lights and through a wooded area and traversed a gully before coming to a stop. A fire broke out and it destroyed the DC-10, but all three people on the DC-10 made it out alive. Now, at this point, you probably expect me to tell you that the tiny Piper was smashed to smithereens and that none of the 9 people on board made it. But by the skin of their teeth, they did survive. You see, when the pilot of the DC-10 commanded left rudder, the plane yawed. He did that in just the right way that the left main and the center main gears kind of straddled the tiny Piper. In simple terms, the left main gear ripped off the right wing of the Piper, and the center main gear ripped off the left wing of the Piper. But the fuselage was small enough that it passed through the space between the two gears, which meant that all 9 people on board survived. On top of that, the nose gear had lifted off just enough that it grazed the skin of the plane above the cockpit, and it went on to rip off the stabilizer. I cannot tell you how close the Piper was to being destroyed. When I started writing this, I didn't go through the synopsis, I just read the report. And when I read about the accident sequence, I was sure that no one would have survived an impact like that. But against all odds, these 9 people did. Someone was looking out for them that day. This left one big DC-10 size question. Why did the DC-10 take off from the wrong runway? Both planes were cleared to completely different runways at different places in the airport. They should not have crossed paths, but yet they did, somehow. Thanks to everyone surviving, the investigators had a wealth of information to go through. It was a very foggy day, and the investigators wanted to know how they handled the fog that day. The pilot of the Piper didn't have too much trouble. He was familiar with the airport and had no problem getting around. The captain of the Korean Airlines jet, on the other hand, had a little bit of trouble. He said that the fog was so thick that he could barely see the yellow taxiway markings on the taxiway. Even when the DC-10 got to the runway, the captain of Korean 064 felt that something was wrong. He looked around for identifying markings in an attempt to see if he was really where he should be. But since the first officer felt sure that they were on the right runway, they decided to go for the takeoff. But they were not on the right runway. You see, they made a crucial mistake. They never got on the east-west taxiway as they intended. To do that, they needed to make a right turn right here. But in the thick fog and the confusion in the cockpit, they completely missed that turn and instead kept going straight, right onto the runway that was being used by the Piper. The fog, it seemed, had doomed them. But it played a part in this accident in a way that you might not expect. The fog kind of messed with the way the pilots of the DC-10 perceived motion. For the pilots to get on the east-west taxiway, they needed to make a 100-degree right turn. But the investigators calculated that they only made a 60-degree right turn. Now, if the day had been sunny, you could easily spot a mistake like that. But with the fog, there were no reference points for the pilots to visually lock on, meaning that they did not turn enough and ended up on the wrong taxiway. But this still leaves a few unanswered questions for the investigators. The pilot said that they discussed the possibility that they were on the wrong runway. In this case, they had an easy way of figuring out if they were on the right runway. They could have used the heading indicators. The heading indicator tells you the direction that you're pointed in. For example, if you were pointing due north, it would show 000. If you were pointing south, then it would say 180 degrees. Like that, if the accident plane was lined up on runway 32 as they should have been, then their heading would have been somewhere around 320 degrees or thereabouts. But since they were lined up on runway 24 right, their heading readout would have actually been around 240 degrees. If someone had just looked at the heading indicator or even a compass, they would have definitely known that they were on the wrong runway. We don't exactly know what went on in that cockpit as the voice recorder was not recovered. The thing is, this would have ended in disaster even if the Piper had not been there. If you look at the map, you can see that they entered runway 24 right near taxiway Whiskey 1. From this point, they had about 2,400 feet. But calculations showed that the 250-ton plane would not have been able to take off with the amount of runway that they had. This DC-10 was going off the runway no matter what. But these were professional pilots who had a lot of experience on this type of airplane, and it almost seems unthinkable that they'd make a mistake like this. So the investigators ran a toxicology report on the pilots. They weren't drunk or fatigued, and they were well rested. The investigators could not figure out why these pilots failed to double-check the runway that they were on. However, they did find out that Korean Airlines did not provide the pilots with any training on runway verification because they felt that it was such a basic task that all pilots would just do it. So they just didn't have any training specifically for it. Now, all of this was made worse by the airport itself. They needed to use 4 taxiway signs to taxi to runway 32, but some of those signs were not illuminated, meaning that it would be hard for the pilots in the cockpit to see it. And some other signs were only partially illuminated. But the crucial signs denoting runway 6 left/runway 24 right were illuminated. But that sign was dirty and the contrast of the sign could have been reduced by snow, ice, and frost. Add to the fact that the crew were looking down at the taxiway markings, And then it becomes apparent how they missed the signs that were there to help guide them to the runway. Thanks to all these factors, they ended up on the wrong runway, and not knowing that there was another tiny plane on the runway waiting to take off, they started their takeoff roll. Why do you think the captain failed to notice that he was on the wrong runway, even though there were tons of signs letting him know that he was in the wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.